Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be talking about witches, specifically medieval witches.
Ooh.
And we're going to be using La Sorcière by Jules Michelet as our main source.
Sounds spooky.
It is. It's really interesting.
Yeah.
It's not like a dry history book.
Okay.
It reads more like a novel.
Wow.
So Michelet,
Yeah.
he had a very interesting take on the whole witchcraft phenomenon.
Yeah, he definitely brings it to life. Like when you read his descriptions of like the Middle Ages and all the anxieties and the fears,
Right.
you can almost feel it like
Yeah.
closing in on you.
The darkness.
Yeah.
It's really something.
Palpable.
So let's kind of set the stage here. What was it about that time period
Yeah.
that made people so susceptible to this whole idea of witchcraft?
Well, think about it like this. Imagine if you lived in a world where there's disease everywhere.
Right.
Famine is like always around the corner. War could break out at any moment.
Mm-hmm.
People were desperate for answers. You know, they needed something to explain all the chaos and all the suffering around them.
So it's kind of a convenient scapegoat.
Yeah, exactly. And, Michelet argues that all this fear combined with the church becoming more and more powerful, it created this perfect storm for witch hunts.
That makes sense. I mean, the church was such a powerful force back then.
Oh, absolutely. And they were definitely not afraid to use their power to enforce their doctrines and control people. This was a time when if you question the church, it could have some pretty serious consequences.
Yeah, absolutely. So how does the figure of the witch fit into all of this?
Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting. Michelet believed that witches represented this clash between the old world and the new.
Okay.
So you had these women who were healers, they were herbalists, midwives. They were carrying on traditions that went back centuries.
Right.
And they were connected to nature and folk wisdom.
And that was seen as a threat.
Well, in a way, yeah. Their knowledge and their practices were outside of the church's control.
Right.
And that made them suspicious.
So these women who were once respected for their healing abilities,
Yeah.
they just kind of became demonized overnight.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
Michelet, he really emphasizes this point that these witch hunts weren't just about religious persecution.
Okay.
It was also about controlling women and suppressing the knowledge that they held.
And he highlights this in his preface. Right?
Yes.
Where he talks about how the church and feudalism kind of contributed to this climate of fear and suspicion, especially towards women.
Exactly. It was this idea that if a woman didn't conform, she was dangerous.
And he uses actual historical examples, right?
He does. He gives examples of women being accused of witchcraft just because they were outspoken.
Wow.
Or independent, or even just for owning property.
It's hard to believe that was enough.
It's a dark chapter in history for sure.
Yeah.
And Michelet doesn't shy away from the brutality of it all.
No, he doesn't. He uses some really vivid language to describe these witch hunts.
He does. It's like he wants you to really feel the terror and the despair of those who are accused of witchcraft. Like, for example, he describes this one scene where this woman is accused of summoning a hailstorm,
Oh, wow.
that ruined the crops. And she's brought before these inquisitors and they strip her and search her for the devil's mark.
Oh, gosh.
The whole scene is so powerful. It really shows how dehumanizing this whole process was.
It's chilling. And it really makes you think about how easily accusations could be made. Like, there wasn't any real evidence needed, just suspicion and fear.
You got it. Michelet really emphasizes how these witch hunts became a way for people to exert power over others.
Yeah.
Settle scores, get rid of someone they didn't like.
So you're saying anyone could be a target?
Pretty much. Especially if you were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And Michelet really highlights the vulnerability of women who were already marginalized widows, for example. After their husbands died, they were often left with no protection or support. They became easy targets.
It's so tragic. It makes you wonder how many innocent people were caught up in all of this.
That's a question that Michelet grapples with throughout the whole book. He's really sympathetic to these women.
Yeah.
And he paints a very humanizing portrait of them. But he doesn't just see them as victims, though.
What do you mean?
Well, he also recognizes their strength and their resilience.
Okay.
He sees them as kind of like rebels in a way, defying the constraints of their time.
That's an interesting perspective. It's not something you hear very often when people talk about the witch hunts.
I know, right? And that's what makes Michelet's work so compelling. He's not just rehashing the same old narrative,
Right.
He's offering a totally new way of looking at this dark period of history.
So how does all of this relate to us today? Why should we care about witch hunts that happened centuries ago?
Well, if you connect it to the bigger picture, it's about recognizing the dangers of unchecked fear and prejudice. It's about understanding how easily those in power can exploit the vulnerable.
So even though this happened a long time ago, there are still lessons we can learn.
Oh, absolutely. Michelet himself was writing in the 19th century,
Mm,
a time of huge social and political upheaval. He saw the witch hunts as like a cautionary tale,
okay.
a warning against fanaticism and blind obedience.
And I guess that message is just as relevant today.
Maybe even more so. I mean, we live in a world where information spreads instantly,
Right.
and it's easy to get caught up in all this fear-mongering and misinformation.
So we're all susceptible to the same kind of thinking that led to the witch hunts.
Well, yeah, to a certain extent. I mean, we all have biases, right?
Right.
And we all make snap judgments based on incomplete information.
That's a scary thought. So how can we guard against that?
Well, Michelet gives us some clues. He talks about the importance of critical thinking,
Okay.
questioning authority, looking beyond the surface of things.
And empathy too, right?
Yes, trying to understand the perspective of those who are different from us. That's so important.
Yeah, I think that's something we could all be a little bit better at.
I agree. And I think that's one of the most valuable lessons we can take away from Michelet's work.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into La Sorcière, what's the one thing you want our listeners to remember?
I think the most important takeaway is that the witch hunts weren't just some isolated event, in the distant past. They were a symptom of a much deeper problem in society. And it's a problem that we're still dealing with today.
The problem of fear, prejudice, and the abuse of power.
Exactly. And it's up to every one of us to confront those things and challenge them wherever we see them.
Yeah, it's amazing to think that a book written so long ago is still so relevant to us today. But I guess that's the power of history, right? It has a way of shining a light on the present.
You said it. And Michelet was a master at connecting the past to the present. He didn't see history as just like a bunch of boring facts and dates.
Right.
He saw it as this living, breathing story that we're all a part of.
And La Sorcière is a perfect example of that. It's not just a book about witches. It's a book about human nature.
Yeah,
It's about the dangers of fear and intolerance.
exactly. And I think that's why it still speaks to people today. It speaks to something deep down inside us.
That capacity for both good and evil.
Right, compassion and cruelty. It reminds us that we're all capable of both. It's a choice we make every day.
Well, this has been a really eye-opening deep dive into the world of medieval witches. I feel like I have a much better understanding of not only that period in history, but also our own time.
Me too. I'm glad you feel that way. I hope our listeners do too.
Before we go, I want to ask you one more question. If Michelet were alive today, what do you think he would say about our world?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I think he'd be both fascinated and horrified.
Okay, how so?
Well, fascinated by all our technology and, how interconnected we are and all the information we have at our fingertips, but also horrified by, the intolerance and extremism that we see.
So it seems like we're still struggling with the same issues that he was writing about over 150 years ago.
I think so, but I also think he'd be hopeful,
Right.
Michelet believed in human progress. He'd see signs of hope in, the movements for social justice and equality and the growing awareness of our shared humanity.
So while we should be aware of the dangers of the past, we shouldn't let them paralyze us.
That's right. We should use them to make positive change, to remind ourselves that we can always choose a different path.
Well said. And on that note, I want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into La Sorcière. And to our listeners, if you're interested in learning more, be sure to check out the book. You won't regret it. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.